All right. Welcome, everybody. We are going to go ahead and get started here. So you are, oops, sorry, okay, here we go. So you are here to hear about transgender inclusion in social work. So as Jenny said, please feel free to jump in with any questions. I hope it alerts me when there are questions. I'll try to check periodically. And Jenny, feel free to chime in if there's a question that we're not getting to, but we're going to try and leave some time at the end to answer questions as well. And then we'll provide our email addresses in case anyone has questions after the fact. So we want to get started with some introductions. So here are some lovely pictures of us, so you can see who is going to be talking to you this afternoon. My name is Amy West. I am a social worker, so I have my BSW and then MSW and MPA from the University of Nebraska, Omaha. I'm a recent hire in the social work department there as well, so I will start this fall on faculty teaching bachelor's students. My history is largely in child welfare. I have some history and experience with more macro type social work, advocacy work in particular. And then I have been involved in the LGBTQ community for quite a long time as well. So I do a lot of volunteer work and advocacy work for that community. And my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I identify as a queer cis woman.
My name is Dylan Murphy. I identify as a queer trans male, and my pronouns are he, him, his. I am a pre-social work student and have been doing social justice advocacy, particularly in the LGBTQ community, for nearly 2 decades. I started the GSA in my high school and protested against Amendment 416, which would have placed an additional ban in the state of Nebraska on same-sex marriage. In more recent times, I have used my personal experiences to educate and raise awareness in regards to transgender issues, juvenile solitary confinement, and eating disorders.
And my name is Miles Jordan. I am a queer trans man of color, and I have been involved in advocacy locally and nationally as far as LGBTQ identities for almost a decade now. I was involved as a leader to a lot of queer youth organizations that I now serve as advisors to. I also was a founding member of the planning committee for Transgender Day of Visibility in Omaha, and am currently a member of the Queer People of Color Nebraska organization.
So we want to start with a quick 101 just to make sure everyone's on the same page in terms of some of the terminology and language that we'll be using today and just in your general understanding of the trans population. So we'll cover some things here real quick and then we'll move on to some implications for social work practice.
So, first is just defining transgender. What is transgender? Well, it is an umbrella term, so it includes a lot of identities, but they're all going to have in common is that it's people who do not identify or exclusively identify with the sex they were assigned at birth. Something important to know about that is that research shows that kids as young as 2 or 3 start to develop their gender identity, understanding of their gender identity, but also keeping in mind that that doesn't mean that if a person didn't know they were trans from when they were young, that doesn't necessarily make it a less true or real identity for them. People come out at all ages. Something else to keep in mind: the prevalence of transgender identities is really hard to pinpoint just because of different social pressures of people not being out or maybe just not being a part of these surveys. Research shows that it's less than 1% of the population that identify as transgender. I personally believe that's probably a huge underestimation due to those things that I mentioned.
So here we have this lovely chart created by TSER, a group of trans students, and we see that we have 5 different sections shown here. First, we have gender identity and gender expression. We then have sex assigned at birth, which is important to distinguish here that sex assigned at birth and gender identity are not the same thing. There is also physical and emotional attraction, which speak to romantic and sexual orientation. For today's information, it is important to remember that these are independent of gender identity and gender expression as well. So, sex assigned at birth. This is the assignment and classification of people as male, female, intersex, or another sex based on a combination of anatomy, hormones, and chromosomes. When a baby is born, the doctor holds it up and exclaims, "It's a boy," or "It's a girl." This is imposed on us before we have a chance to develop our own sense of self. So again, it's really important to remember that sex assigned at birth does not dictate one's gender identity. Gender identity is one's internal sense of being male, female, neither of these, both, or another gender. Everyone has a gender identity, including you. For transgender people, their sex assigned at birth and their own internal sense of gender identity are not the same. Gender expression is how one exhibits or presents their gender identity through things such as clothing, hairstyle, personality traits, and so forth. Most transgender people seek to make their gender expression, how they look, match their gender identity, who they are, rather than their sex assigned at birth. The next thing we want to look at is that gender identity and gender expression are on a spectrum. So, as an example, I was assigned female at birth, however, I identify as transgender. My gender identity would fall mostly to the right of the male spectrum, while also falling somewhere on the left to the middle of the neutral or other gender spectrum. In terms of my gender expression, I would again fall mostly to the right on the male spectrum, but also on the left of the feminine spectrum and in the middle of the other gender spectrum. Amy, on the other hand, was assigned female at birth. She identifies as a woman, so she is cisgender, but she possesses personality traits that might be deemed by society more masculine on the expression spectrum.
Yeah, so that was kind of an overview of what we're talking about with these. We're going to get a little bit more specific into some of the terminology that you'll be hearing throughout this presentation. So you've already heard the term cisgender, which means a person who was assigned a gender at birth that they still identify with. So a cisgender man would be a person who was assigned male at birth and still identifies as male or a man, and typically would use he, him, his pronouns. And a cisgender woman would be a person who was assigned female at birth, still identifies as female or a woman, and uses she, her, hers pronouns. And then on the other hand of that, what we're talking about today are transgender identities, so people who do not identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth, as we said. Some other terms that will be used really commonly transgender will just be shortened to trans. I know that when I introduce myself, I usually just say trans. Transsexual is another term that we're seeing used less and less often simply because it's a very medicalized term. And then a term that we never want to use is transvestite because by its definition it's inaccurate and it's also been used a lot as a slur towards the community. So a common way that you'll see the trans community broken down is to MTF and FTM. So that stands for female to male and male to female. Recently, we've kind of expanded that and started using trans masculine and trans feminine to include people who were assigned one specific gender at birth and have transitioned kind of towards the other end of the spectrum without necessarily identifying as the other gender that society usually provides. So a trans masculine person would be anybody who's assigned female at birth and identifies as any masculine identity. And usually the pronouns a trans masculine person would use are he, him, and his. And a trans feminine person would be the opposite of that. So someone who is assigned male at birth identifies more in the feminine identities, usually using pronouns she, her, and hers. But those have also expanded to include more non-binary identities because, as Dylan talked about, gender exists on a spectrum, not just as one or the other, as we're a lot of times taught as kids. So there are a lot of non-binary identities. So a few of the common ones, there are hundreds, but some of the common ones you'll hear are genderqueer and gender fluid, which are defined as people who identify as their gender being something that changes, that moves around, that's really flexible, and they might kind of move around on the spectrum. Agender using the prefix a, so meaning an absence of. So an agender person doesn't identify as having a gender, identify with gender at all. Bigender is the prefix bi, so meaning two, so a person who identifies as having more than one gender, and maybe it changes based on the day, on how they feel in the moment. These are all kind of ones where you would really understand them best by talking to a person who identifies that way. And then for demigender, demi is half, so that's somebody who identifies partially with a specific gender, but also mostly as a non-binary person. And then two-spirit is something we wanted to make sure that we mention. It is a term that has a lot of different definitions. It arises from Native American traditions, and could be different depending on the tribe that uses it. So it's an extremely broad term. The really important thing to know with that one is that if you are not a Native individual, it's inappropriate for you to use that as your personal identity. Um, so pronouns for non-binary identities, there are lots of them. They're going to be the gender-neutral pronouns. So the singular they, them, their. Other ones that are common are ze and here. And then the last thing we want to talk about in this terminology basics is intersex. So intersex is a little bit complicated because it would fall under the trans umbrella, but is more related to sex assigned at birth than other trans identities, in that an intersex person is somebody who in some way could not be clearly categorized medically as male or female. So that could be somebody with an extra chromosome or somebody with ambiguous secondary or primary sex characteristics.
Okay, so now we've gone through some of the basics. Hopefully you're very quickly up to speed with what we're talking about here. We want to go into some social work specific implications. So what we'll do first is talk about some suggestions that we have for working with trans people or being a good supporter of the trans community. And we're going to break those up, and because I'm a social worker, we'll break those up into micro and macro suggestions. So we will start with the micro, the more individualized stuff. One of the first things that you can and should do if you're interested in becoming a supporter of this community is to just educate yourself, or educate yourself. So that you've taken a great first step by being here today, attending webinars or trainings or talks or any kind of event specific to trans people is a great way to learn about that community. There's also tons and tons and tons of reading that you can do. So when I myself first started becoming more interested in learning about the trans community, I just Googled a lot. Google has a lot of information to share. So if you take that extra initiative, you can find plenty of articles on just about anything, and you can really take a lot of initiative in educating yourself. Another way to make sure that you're educating yourself is to ask questions. So in this webinar, if you have questions, I hope you feel comfortable asking them. In other forums where it's appropriate, other trainings related to trans people, ask the questions that you have. I want to caution being a little bit careful with this one, so I would not suggest going up to a random person on the street who you think might be trans, or even if you know a trans person, be a little careful about the types of questions you ask people directly when they're not putting themselves out in an educational format. But in situations like this where it's a webinar or training or panel discussion, that's a great opportunity to get your questions answered.
And the next one is dismantle the binary. So I mentioned that our gender system set up in our society is very binary, but there are a lot of people who don't fall in that. So there are some really simple things we can do in our day-to-day lives to allow for that and not force people into boxes. One of the first ones is avoiding using ma'am and sir with strangers and just kind of using gender-neutral terms. So instead of you guys saying y'all, I mean, we're not all Southern, but it works. Or saying folks is something that I do a lot. Or really, even when you're in the grocery store thanking somebody, you don't have to say ma'am or sir. You can say thank you and be just as polite. Another one is to avoid splitting into groups based on gender. So instead of splitting a class or a group of people into boys and girls or men and women, counting off 1 and 2 or splitting the room in half. And then, if possible, offering gender-inclusive bathrooms. So this is really easy, especially if there's a single stall bathroom available in the space that you're using. You can designate it for that day or for that activity as gender-neutral. Or if you have the power to, just making sure that there is one that is always gender-neutral in a specific space.
Another thing, particularly if you are cisgender, is to be a buddy in a gendered space. So Miles talked a little bit about how binary and gendered our society is. We do a lot of things where we split people up by their gender. We see this in schools all the time, in school locker rooms, in college dorm rooms. We see activities where boys and girls are split into different groups. And then, of course, bathrooms. Bathrooms are Perhaps I'm sure something that you've heard about in the media related to trans people, because there's been a lot of conversation about this lately, and it is an incredibly gendered space. So this is, kind of goes along with the whole "see something, say something" campaign, but specific to trans people. If you're in a setting and you see someone being harassed or called out because somebody else is thinking that they don't belong in that space, that's your opportunity to stand up with them and serve as an ally and a protector in that setting. Unless someone is doing something illegal in a bathroom, it's really nobody's business as to what their sex assigned at birth is. There has been a national campaign. You see on that little button on the screen, it's hashtag I'll go with you. So there's been a national campaign to stand with trans people, because the bathrooms can really be a dangerous space for them. So you'll see people sometimes wearing these buttons or just talking about it or posting about it online, to make it clear that they are a safe person, that if a trans person has to go into a gendered space that they're a little bit nervous about, that cisgender person will go with them and be protective. There's also been a local campaign here in Omaha with a trans woman who has begun taking selfies in different bathrooms with cis women to show I belong here just as much as anybody else. So things like that are ways that cis people can be a good supporter of the trans community as well. Hey Dylan, what's your pronouns?
My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm really glad you asked because it's always better to ask someone than to assume. It is okay to ask. Otherwise, you run the risk of accidentally invalidating someone's identity, and this already happens all the time for trans people. Normalize it. You can do so by putting pronouns on emails and business cards. Use pronouns in settings where you do introductions, for example, support group settings. The reality is that we don't know when there is someone who is trans or not in any situation, so this is a really easy way to be inclusive of everyone and make sure people know that they are, in fact, in a safe space. Um, One thing to remember is it's only awkward if you make it awkward. Um, Another thing to remember is that someone's pronouns might vary per situation. For example, a teenager might not be out to their parents yet, so it's really good to make sure that you know if you can use those pronouns in all contexts or not.
So nothing about us without us. This is another one that really can be applied to anybody, any marginalized group of people. But what it means is just the best way to serve trans people is to include trans people. So the people who are going to know best what trans people need and want are going to be people who exist in that identity and in that group of people. So, for example, in this webinar, Amy inviting Dylan and I to be a part of it, was her way of making sure that there are trans voices included in the presentation.
And I would say too on this one that this could be applied in a lot of different situations. So presentations like this one, where I was asked to present as a social worker, but immediately I was like, okay, so what trans folks can I involve to make sure that this is a really meaningful presentation? Panels, if you have a panel about trans people or LGBTQ people, making sure to have people that represent that identity on the panel. This could be used in classroom conversations. If there's a discussion on the trans population, could be used in in-house trainings for your programs. Really, any context that is publicly presenting information on trans people should include a trans person.
And then the next one, put your money where your mouth is. So making sure that there is an inclusion policy for your organization and one that specifically includes transgender people and identities. So something really easy to do, for example, an equal employment ordinance statement should include not just sexual orientation, but also gender identity and expression.
Another thing is do your best to be a guide in navigating the system. Um, The system for some or all trans folks may include connecting them to medical professionals to prescribe hormones, help with surgeries, or are knowledgeable and safe for trans people to seek health care from. Another would be connecting them to mental health providers who are trans friendly and knowledgeable, and helping them navigate legal documents for things such as name change procedures, changing gender markers, A really good resource for this is the Professional Transgender Resource Network. This was created in Nebraska. They offer information on their website about things from anywhere from safe mental health professionals to the name change process in Nebraska.
And then another really easy way to provide that safety for trans people is to update your forms. So instead of having the gender section on your form say male and female with checkboxes, the most inclusive way that we could come up with was to have man, woman, and then another gender with the blank. So a person can just tell you what their gender identity is right there. And then another way to make sure you're doing that is to have two lines for a name. So have legal name and the name that they want you to use, or a preferred name. And this helps to show that so they don't have to guess which name they should write down. And then, of course, after that, make sure that you and all of the people in that situation and in that space know that they are to use the preferred name and not the legal name.
Don't out someone. You should never out someone without explicit previous permission. This is really dangerous because even someone you think might be a safe person to disclose information to might in fact not be. Trans people are already at a vastly increased risk of harassment, physical assault, and even murder, particularly trans women of color. And also, this is just an extreme violation of someone's privacy.
Okay, so that covers some of the more micro things that we wanted to suggest to you today. And so we're going to broaden the lens a bit and look at some of the macro level suggestions that we'd have for you.
So the first more macro thing you can do in support of trans people is just show up, and that's honestly the easiest one. So it's just attending things that are already there and have already been created for you. So attending rallies, about trans rights, or so in support of trans people, coming out in support of other agencies that have inclusive policies or work with the trans population, attending your local Transgender Day of Visibility event, and of course listening to and providing platforms for trans folks to use their voice in all sorts of different settings. So that could be really anything where if you have the opportunity, make sure that you do include and amplify the voices of the trans people around you.
Another macro level step you can take is, of course, be an advocate. So this could include something as simple as making sure that when you're voting, you're looking at progressive policies and progressive people who you know will be good advocates and allies to the trans community. It's contacting your state senator when local legislation comes up here in Nebraska that's relevant to trans folks or to LGBTQ folks, testifying at hearings if you're able to that are related to trans folks. Even if you are not someone who works specifically with the trans population, coming out in support is a really, really big deal, particularly at those legislative hearings. Writing your policymakers, writing op-eds, there's a lot of different ways that you can be an outspoken advocate for this population. And there's plenty of opportunity right now in our climate here in the United States. There's been a lot of national conversation, like I mentioned, about bathroom policies for trans people, both on a national basis, and then also, unfortunately, we've seen a lot of states passing laws that prohibit trans people from using the appropriate bathroom. So essentially forcing trans people to use the bathroom that corresponds with their sex assigned at birth and not with their actual gender. And that's really dangerous and really scary for a lot of trans people. So luckily, we haven't seen that happen here yet in Omaha or in Nebraska. But be on the lookout if that ever should become the situation. That's really when we need a lot of people coming out in support of the trans population. There was also a policy that was passed just a few months ago by the Nebraska School Activities and Athletics Association for trans students who are in high school and I think elementary school as well, who are interested in playing sports. And unfortunately, this policy made it a bit more complicated for trans students to be able to have access to playing sports for their school. So those are opportunities that, unfortunately, that policy has already been passed, but it will likely be up again, and that would present an opportunity to, again, use your voice. And then state laws are something to always keep an eye on, as I mentioned. There's a statewide employment equality bill that that has come up for the past couple sessions, and it will likely come up this legislative session again in January, that would prohibit employers from being able to fire someone based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. So could obviously have a huge impact for a lot of folks, but it hasn't been able to be passed yet. So we need a lot of people speaking up for trans people and contacting their senators, especially if you are outside of Omaha and Lincoln. We need to show support in order for progressive policies to be passed.
And then we did get a question
Yes.
that popped up. It says, how do you suggest we respond to people that oppose gender-inclusive bathrooms?
I think, well, when we talked about that, really the easiest way to do gender inclusive bathrooms is using already existing single stall bathrooms or having single stall bathrooms. Because I'm assuming in the question that they're thinking of a lot of the response people will give about safety or about, oh, we're working with minors, like we can't have them using the same bathroom, different things like that. So when you have a single stall bathroom, it's very easy and very safe, and usually that can kind of be the response to people who might be worried about that.
I would say also, if you were thinking more of some of the national pushback against trans people being able to use the bathroom that corresponds with their actual gender, there's a lot of misinformation floating around about that. So as much actual education as you can provide about what happens when trans people use the bathroom. There are varying articles that say there's like maybe a couple incidents and 0 incidents of trans people attacking someone else in the bathroom. So I would cite that information because a lot of people are spreading, I think, fear-mongering lies about that happening. And then also making the point that the people who are actually at risk in the bathroom is trans people themselves. I forget the statistic, but it's something astronomical. Like 90% of trans people have reported harassment while they are using the bathroom, compared to like maybe 1 or 2 reported cases of a trans person attacking someone else in the bathroom. So I think that's a good place to start. It's difficult because there's a lot of fear-mongering happening with that, and it comes from a lot of baseless stuff. But I think that's a good place to start. Good question.
Support organizations fighting the good fight. You can do this by giving what you can or seeing if they have volunteer opportunities. Some local organizations are ACLU of Nebraska, which emphasizes equality before the law. Our state chapter has helped the LGBTQ community in many ways. An example of this is a transgender voice project they did, compiling stories of transgender individuals living in Nebraska. GLSEN, an organization fighting to end anti-gay bias in K-12 schools. PTRN, which was mentioned earlier, is a great place to find local resources for the trans community. PFLAG, which works to move equality forward in Nebraska. They offer monthly meetings for support and education regarding sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. Heartland Pride, which organizes and holds the annual Pride Festival in Omaha. QNYN, which is the only youth-focused, peer-led group providing social activities, connections to resources, and confidential online discussion to lesbian, gay, bi, trans, and queer youth in Nebraska. Proud Horizons, an Omaha-based support group for LGBTQ plus youth. And nationally, ACLU, which is operated at a national level as well. Lambda Legal, the nation's oldest and largest legal organization working for the civil rights of LGBTQ individuals. Lambda Legal's help desk provides information and resources regarding discrimination related to sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and also HIV status. The National Center for Transgender Equality is the nation's leading social justice advocacy organization winning life-saving change for transgender people. The Trevor Project, a national 24-hour toll-free confidential suicide hotline for queer youth. Trans Student Educational Resources is a youth-led organization dedicated to transforming the educational environment for trans students. and Trans Lifeline, which is a 24/7 suicide prevention hotline by and for trans individuals. Trans individuals are already at a really heightened risk for suicide, and two major things that have happened in our country recently, um, one being, as we've mentioned, the bathroom laws that have been passed or brought about, and two, the shooting in Orlando, have caused a drastic increase in call volume. At the same time, Trans Lifeline recently lost a significant amount of their funding. One thing you could do if you're able is to donate to Trans Lifeline and help them make up some of the lost funding so we can be sure that they're able to stick around, as there is such a great need for them.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of suggestions about things that you individually can do to be a good support and a good social worker on behalf of trans people. We want to talk about, I guess we're going to add on a bit of a downer, or we're going to end on a bit of a downer, but we want to share some what not to do's. And what I think will be helpful in this situation is we wanted to use some personal examples to really bring it home, that Dylan and Miles are willing to share about themselves or about trans folks that any of us know personally. So the stories that you're going to hear next are things that have happened specifically to the people that we know. So we're going to start again with a more micro focus, and then we'll broaden it up and get a little larger with the macro.
Hey, so I talked earlier about forums and having a place for a legal name and a preferred name. And so I have a kind of a story for that. For when I first started testosterone, I went to a doctor's office that was very progressive and inclusive. They had that option on their paperwork, and I hadn't legally changed my name. So I wrote down my legal name and then I wrote my preferred name. And everybody there did a really good job of using my correct name. But then after the appointment, I had to go to a different part of the hospital to get some blood work done. And at that appointment, I was sitting in the waiting room, and they came up and they called my legal name out. So it's kind of if you can kind of imagine what it would feel like to have somebody like um, reveal something really private about you and say something inaccurate, and then you have to like get up and walk across the room in front of all of these strangers right after that. So that's an example of a way that them being more cognizant of using the preferred name on the form would have kind of spared me that really uncomfortable experience. And unfortunately, that's not the only time that something like that has happened to me. There was also a time that happened in a former therapist's office where she knew that I had changed my name but just forgot to use it. And it was very unintentional, but it was still just as hurtful to have her say my legal name across the room and then I have to get up and walk across. So that's just something to be really aware of. Whether it's intentional or not, it's extremely harmful to the person that experiences it.
Also, as we've talked about, is using correct pronouns. So, an example from my life for this is I worked with a therapist pre transition, and then I actually ended up working with them again after I was pretty far into my transition. They, however, continued to accidentally use the incorrect pronouns. So while this was accidental, this still had a huge impact on me and the therapeutic relationship.
So another one is guessing people's pronouns. Dylan mentioned earlier that it's completely okay to ask, and then I also mentioned that sometimes it's just not necessary to gender a person. So I have a story that it's kind of funny now looking back on it, but at the time it was really awkward. I was working as a barista at a coffee shop, and I was just handing someone their coffee, and I handed it to them, and they were like, "Thank you, sir," and then kind of did a double cake, and were like, "I mean, ma'am." I mean, sir. And it just kind of went on for a while, and it was really awkward. And it's like I said, it's kind of funny now, but it was just a situation where, first of all, they didn't need to; it wasn't necessary. They could have said thank you, and then also if you switch back and forth and prolong it, it just makes it really awkward. So kind of just being able to move on is important.
Hopefully, now you're being intentional about people's pronouns, but sometimes slip ups do happen. Typically, trans people don't expect you to be perfect 100% of the time. However, should a slip up happen, don't over apologize. This is what makes it awkward. I was at a restaurant once and was misgendered. The waitress then proceeded to apologize for a few minutes, actually walked away, and then came back to apologize for about 5 more minutes. If you slip up, just apologize once and move on.
Okay, and we're back to bathrooms. So this is a huge issue for trans people. We've talked a lot about this today already, and we had a great question about this. But a huge real world don't is do not worry about what someone's gender is or what their sex assigned at birth might be when they're in the bathroom, or really ever. Unless someone's doing something otherwise illegal in a bathroom, there's really no need to worry about that or to ask someone like, hey, do you belong here? So there's tons and tons and tons of stories that trans folks could share about their bathroom experiences, and if you Google, I'm sure you could find a lot of them. The story that I know that happened to somebody that I know was this person was a student, and so they were in the classroom and had already kind of suspected that a couple people in that classroom were thinking that they might be trans or couldn't fully tell what gender they were. So they went to the bathroom during class, and that group of people actually followed them into the bathroom and blocked them into the stall, and wouldn't let them come out, and were talking and laughing and kind of forced them to stay in there. And so finally that group of people left, thank goodness. But when that individual, my friend, left, they left the building and went out to see that their car had also been vandalized. So not only did they have to go through the stress and fear of being trapped in a bathroom stall and not really sure what was about to happen, but then they left and found that their property had been damaged as well. So we're going to broaden once again and look at some macro or bigger picture real world don'ts.
So one big one is just forgetting to be inclusive, or forgetting who the audience is that you're trying to cater to. An example here was recently there was an LGBTQ program that was being started up by a group of people, and it sounded really cool. It was something that Nebraska could really use, and so I attended an informational meeting about it. And in that meeting, they passed around the idea for a floor plan they had for this program. And in that floor plan, I noticed that they had only men's and women's bathrooms. When you're building something new for the LGBT community, that's obviously kind of problematic, and showed that they were not keeping in mind the audience that they were trying to cater to. And I think that also points to including trans people in the planning of things, because if there had been a trans identified person in the initial planning committee for that program, I'm sure that oversight wouldn't have happened.
So another example is there was a local organization doing a training and putting on a panel in regards to trans folks and eating disorders. And they worked with this population, but I came to find out that they elected to not include any trans folks in the discussion on the panel. And it's just, again, there should be nothing about us without us.
And then another one is just assuming that everyone in a situation is cisgender. It's very common that there are trans people in a space who maybe aren't out, and maybe you don't know that there are trans people in that space. So a personal example I have is an organization that I used to work for, where I was a new employee, and I was kind of feeling it out to see if it was a safe place for me to be open about my identities or not. And in part of our EEO training, I was looking at their policy, which, as I mentioned earlier, included sexual orientation, but didn't say anything about gender identity. Then also, just in following conversations and trainings throughout this, there was no mention of gender identity, of trans identities. And I think a lot of that just happened because of the assumption that there weren't any trans people in the room, but they didn't know that I was a trans person.
So another real world don't, letting the opposition overpower. So this one relates a lot to what I talked about earlier with advocacy steps that we can all take. Because there is, as you know, a huge outpouring against the trans community, and a lot of fear mongering happened, and a lot of misinformation is happening as well. So So this is when we as cisgender supporters and allies of the trans community really need to let our voices be heard and be heard loudly, because that's what the opposition is doing. I mentioned the school activities policy earlier that is limiting the ability of trans students to participate in sports with their school. Prior to that policy, there was actually a protest that was organized and led by a trans student in high school who was against this policy, and that's great. Actually, all three of us ended up going. And it was a great protest. There were media there, which was wonderful, but unfortunately only about 50 people showed up. So I wonder if there had been a huge outpouring against the policy, whether that policy would have passed. And I think it's the same with legislative hearings. If we don't push pressure on state senators to vote a certain way, then they do whatever it is that they want to do personally. And the majority of the time with the state senators that we're looking at, unfortunately, I don't think they're going to go in a way that's supportive to trans people. So it's really on us to step up and share our voices. I see a red hand. Does that mean that there's a question, Jenny?
Yes, there is. I was just waiting for the right opportunity.
The pause.
So we had a question that says that they were just wondering if you can explain if there's any significance for the reason of spelling folks with an X.
Great question. Miles, do you want to?
Yeah, there are a lot of different words that you might see ending with an X. One recently that I remember explaining to people was in articles about the shooting in Orlando, that it said Latinx instead of Latino, Latina. And what that is it's taking off the ending and kind of making it inclusive of people of all gender identities, including non-binary. So really ending a plural with an X is just kind of a visible way to show that you're including those people.
Another good question.
Yeah.
And one more thing to keep in mind is don't just call yourself an ally. Good feelings do no good for the community. An example of this is I was recently speaking with someone who had admitted that they showed a lot of support for the trans community and really supported them, but it took them a realization that they actually need to earn that ally title by showing up, and because it's really great if you support us in your heart, but we need you showing up for us on a far greater level than that, just that.
Okay, so we're...
one more question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, in regards to nothing about us without us, they're wondering if you would say it would be disrespectful or inappropriate for an organization to train employees on this information if there are no trainers available who identify as anything other than cisgender.
That's a great question as well. Well, do one of you two want to speak to that?
I think it's really easy to try and reach out and find someone maybe outside the organization who is willing to come in and share their experience and share education that would be including of trans folks.
Yeah, I think so. You might have a specific trainer for your program, and like that's totally fine and great. And they could, if they're educated, they could probably handle a lot of the presentation. But I think, as Dylan said, like taking the extra step and trying to find someone outside of that agency to just come in and serve as like a person that they can ask questions of, or to help with part of the presentation, or whatever role that individual feels comfortable playing, I think is also really important. Like we mentioned earlier for this webinar, Dylan's a social work student, and I think Miles is interested in social work generally, but I was asked as a social worker to do this training. So I didn't necessarily think like, okay, who do I know who's also a member of the NASW to do this training with me? I went outside of that organization. So I guess it depends on like what your agency's policies are, but I think if nothing else, at least making a trans person available to be present and answer questions and perhaps share some personal experiences is a way to include trans people and then also give your audience a more meaningful presentation, because then they actually get to meet a trans person. Because surprise or not a surprise, a lot of folks don't think that they've ever met a trans person or known a trans person, which probably isn't accurate, but at least in that setting you would for sure be able to say, like, here's a trans person, and that humanizes the community as well.
We got a couple more questions that popped up. Do you want me to just wait for your question and answer session?
Yeah, this is actually our last slide, so we might just go over this real quick, and
That's
then we
what I
can
thought.
answer many questions. Yes, thank you, Jenny. So how to learn even more. We hope that we provided some practical suggestions in this presentation, but there's a lot of information that we're just not able to cover in an hour. So I think it's really important for all of you who are interested to continue doing some research on your own. Dylan talked about each of these 3 organizations that are up here on your screen. All 3 are great. They have a lot of resources that you can look through. But then also, like I said earlier, Googling is a great way to learn more. Obviously, you might have to be careful about which articles you click on, but generally when I've been looking, I find pretty good information. You're also more than welcome to reach out to any of us. I included all of our email addresses on here too. So for instance, the person who asked the question about including a trans person in their agency's training, perhaps if it's semi-close to Omaha, perhaps Dylan or Miles would be willing to come and speak with your staff. Or if nothing else, we could work to try and find someone out in that area who might be willing to as well. Or, I mean, if you just have questions after this presentation that you didn't think of during, that's totally fine to email us about too. So thank you for listening, and we'll take some more questions. I want to circle back real quick to the first question that was asked about trans bathrooms, because I think that's a really important question, and it's complex because, I mean, on any issue that is viewed as quote-unquote controversial, there's going to be people that are swayable, and there's going to be people that just aren't swayable. And so to a certain extent, there might not always be a way that you can change someone's mind. But I do think what we said earlier about referencing actual factual statistics and any kind of research on the actual threat of trans people being in the bathroom is good, but also I think trying to humanize trans people as much as possible is really important, because a lot of the fear mongering that I've seen online, trans people are not painted in a positive light. Trans women in particular are really painted as like scary men wearing a dress, and that's not at all accurate, and it's incredibly offensive. So I think a lot of the way to change people's hearts on issues is to expose them more to that population and humanize it, so it's not as easy to dehumanize it. So if you have people who are like, well, I don't agree, I think it's dangerous, part of the problem is just that they don't understand what transgender people who they actually are. So I think the ACLU did a great job of sharing those videos of local trans people, and there's some trans women that they also interviewed, and it's just people talking about their lives. So it's a really easy way. You could forward someone a few videos of just trans people talking about their lives, so they can see that, like, these are actual people. They're just humans like you and I. They just want to pee. And maybe that would also help make it a little bit more difficult for them to be demonized. Okay, other questions?
Okay. So one of the questions was if Miles or Dylan were able to speak for a college class. So I think you already answered that one. So they had their emails up, and if you guys didn't get them down, I'm sure if you
there they are again.
Email us. Oh, there we go. There, that will be perfect. Thank you. Okay. The other question was, when talking with families, are there recommended words to use for relationships, like niece and nephew, etc.?
Are you asking about, like, if a person has a non-binary identity, coming up with terms, or?
I don't know if you probably don't have that information, Jenny. I don't know if you can unmute the. Well, I think we could.
That's what I had.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think as far as a lot of those familial terms are very gendered, and of course, if the person does identify as male or masculine, making sure you're using like nephew and uncle and the appropriate terms that way. If it's a situation where a person maybe is non-binary and uses gender-neutral pronouns and you don't know the words, a lot of times it might just end up coming down to using the more long-winded thing, like saying my sister's child instead of niece or nephew. But there are also some gender-neutral terms. I'm trying to think of. I'm trying to think of some examples. I'm coming
For
up with.
families.
Can you
I mean, I
of-
think the easiest thing to do it would be to ask that family
Yeah.
member also. So if you're not sure how somebody wants to be talked about in the third person, whether it's with their pronouns or whether it's with any other familial labels or anything else, I think just ask that person. They'll appreciate that you're taking the time, that you want to be accurate about representing their identity.
And that's another great opportunity for Google because that's how I found some of those words. So you would be able to find them.
Yeah. Were there any other questions? Jenny, were there any other questions?
I was just waiting to see if there weren't. Wait, let me see. Oh, okay, one just popped up.
Okay, cool.
Okay. I know the question says, I know that you explained this earlier, but will you clarify what it means when somebody calls themselves queer?
Oh, yeah. Great question.
Yeah, the term queer is very big term that can be used in a lot of different ways, so it's definitely difficult to define. I would say that there are a few different specific ways it's commonly used. One is as a personal identity. So Dylan and I both mentioned, I think Amy as well, that we identify as queer as our sexual orientation. And for that purpose of use, it's going to depend a lot on the person, how it's defined. So again, like Amy said, for me, what I would want is somebody to come up and ask me, okay, you identify as queer, what does that mean to you? Can you explain that a little bit more? Just in that personal one-to-one level, because there isn't really an umbrella consistent way that that's used as far as a sexual orientation. Another thing, I know a lot of people sometimes are nervous about using that word when they're not part of the community because it has historically been a slur. And I will say, generally, in a lot of communities, it has been reclaimed. But I wouldn't say to just use it freely everywhere. You kind of have to know your audience and the area that you're in because there might be some, just depending on geographic location, places where they haven't really reclaimed that word yet. But I know for us and for Omaha in a large way, it has been reclaimed. And also it's kind of used as a political term in a way to connect yourself to the movement for queer rights beyond just personal identities.
Yeah, I think as Miles said, it's an expression of sexual orientation, but then also kind of like a lifestyle thing. So I explain it as kind of an umbrella term in and of itself, just like earlier when Miles was talking about what transgender or trans identities are, there was a lot of stuff under that list. The same is true for queer. So it's kind of used as an umbrella term, and it could mean a lot of things to different people. I think we have like 1 or 2 minutes left. 1 minute left. Any quick questions?
Nothing so far.
Okay. Oh.
Nope. Okay. Never mind.
Okay. That's totally fine. As I said earlier, please feel free to email any of us individually or all of us in a group email, whatever you want to do. If you think of questions after this or if you want more information on anything that we talked about today, thank you so much for attending. We were excited to do this presentation for you, so we really appreciate your interest in learning about how to be a better support to the trans community, and we hope you continue to educate yourself. And again, thank you for listening.
Thanks.
Thanks.